It was 1 a.m. A cold rain hammered the city. Single father Daniel Hayes, drenched after his shift, walked through the business district. He saw her, a woman slumped on the sidewalk. Her gown was stained. Her heels lay abandoned. People saw her, paused, and walked away. Daniel ran to her side. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" She weakly mumbled, "Don't touch me. Everyone leaves me." He covered her shivering body with his jacket. He spoke, "I don't know who you are, but I will not leave you here." He had no idea. The woman was the CEO of the company where he was scheduled to interview the following morning. Daniel Hayes, 37 years old, carried the weight of the city and the weight of his family on his shoulders. A single father, he had spent the last decade working as a diligent, reliable maintenance engineer. But 3 weeks ago, the company he served had filed for bankruptcy. Now he was desperately seeking new employment to keep a roof over the head of his only child, 8-year-old Lily. Lily was the center of his universe, a small, bright beacon in a world that often felt dark and unforgiving. She had an innocence that Daniel cherished, and a simple, powerful mantra she often repeated. "Dad," she would say, her eyes wide and sincere, "no matter how bad people might be, we still have to be good, okay?" It was a rule Daniel lived by. He had just finished a temporary night shift at a small factory, a grueling 12-hour ordeal that paid barely enough to cover his basic expenses. The rain was freezing as he walked home, every muscle aching. He briefly stepped into a convenience store to grab a carton of milk, Lily's favorite. When he reached the grand marble plaza that housed the city's major corporate headquarters, he noticed a small knot of people gathered, whispering, then quickly dissipating into the night. Curiously, he approached the spot they had been looking at. There, on a cold stone bench, was a figure collapsed. It was a woman, unmistakably wealthy. Her rain-soaked hair clung to her perfectly structured face, and a powerful, sharp scent of expensive alcohol emanated from her. Her evening gown was already ruined, stained with grime from the sidewalk. Her vulnerability was shockingly exposed. "Miss, are you all right?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside her. She stirred slightly, lifting her head just enough to slur a response, her words barely audible over the drumming rain. "You'll leave too. Everyone does in the end." Her voice was laced with deep, raw pain that alcohol could not mask. Not. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his own wet hair. He didn't know the story, but he recognized true despair when he saw it. He carefully unzipped his jacket. It was a heavy, durable jacket, still smelling faintly of machine oil, but it was dry underneath. He gently covered her shoulders with the warm fabric. A sudden, fierce gust of wind ripped across the plaza. The woman shivered violently, her teeth chattering. Daniel knew he couldn't leave her exposed to the elements any longer. Exposure was a real danger. Without a second thought, and with a surprisingly gentle strength, he scooped her up. He carried her like a child, supporting her weight as he searched for shelter. He spotted a neon sign cutting through the darkness, a 24-hour coffee shop around the corner. He carried her inside. The young barista, who was wiping down the counter, looked up and grimaced. "Mister, are you crazy? She's completely wasted. Get her out of here." Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply held the woman securely and met the barista's gaze. "I don't leave anyone alone in the middle of a rainstorm." He sat her down in a secluded booth, ordered her a glass of water, and then called a reputable local taxi service. He knew he couldn't take her home to Lily, and he couldn't leave her in the cafe. He instructed the cab driver to take them to a clean, well-rated hotel nearby. At the hotel reception desk, Daniel swiftly paid for a night's stay with the money he'd been saving for Lily's school supplies. He ensured the night manager, a kindly, older gentleman, would escort the woman to the room and keep an eye on her. He left a simple, folded note on the counter, next to the room key. "I don't know who you are, but please know that you are safe now. I hope you wake up well tomorrow. D." And then Daniel Hayes turned and walked back into the cold rain, His mission complete. He never asked her name. He never looked for a way to contact her. He simply did the right thing, and he walked home. The night manager, Mr. Chen, later recounted the event. That man, Mr. D, he was soaked to the bone, just dripping water onto our pristine lobby floor. He paid cash for the room and left. No questions about her identity, no phone number, no photo taken. I believe he truly, honestly only wanted to help a soul in distress. The following morning, Daniel was up before dawn. He polished his one decent pair of shoes, straightened his tie, and meticulously reviewed his application. Today was the day. His interview at Voss Innovations, one of the largest, most powerful technology conglomerates in the city. The opportunity was immense, and the pressure was staggering. He arrived at the Voss headquarters precisely 15 minutes early. The building was a shimmering tower of glass and steel, a monument to cutting-edge technology and unimaginable wealth. As Daniel stepped into the cavernous, futuristic lobby, his breath caught in his throat, but not because of the architecture. Mounted on the central wall spanning 3 floors was a massive, high-definition advertising poster. It featured a woman's face, a portrait of stark beauty, intense focus, and undeniable authority. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. His lips moved soundlessly. No, it can't be. He walked closer, recognizing the perfect jawline, the piercing eyes, the fierce look of a woman who held the world in the palm of her hand. It was the woman from the cold, wet sidewalk. The polished receptionist noticed his hesitation. She smiled politely. "That is Ms. Clara Voss, our chief executive officer," she informed him with pride. "She's quite the force of nature." Just then, the executive elevator doors, made of dark seamless metal, slid open with a soft chime. Clara Voss stepped out. Her hair was perfectly styled, her black power suit was immaculate, and her face was a mask of cold, flawless perfection. There was not a trace of the desperate, drunken ruin of the night before. She looked completely untouchable. As she strode past, her heels clicking precisely on the marble, Daniel instinctively lowered his head, hoping to blend into the professional crowd. He held his worn briefcase tighter and prayed she hadn't noticed him. He moved toward the security checkpoint, feeling his cheeks flush with embarrassment and disbelief. He was eventually led to the 3rd-floor conference room for his initial interview. The session with the HR team was going well. He was competent, experienced, and practical. Then the door opened. The head of HR stood up quickly, showing obvious deference. "Ms. Voss," he stammered, "I thought you were in a meeting." Clara Voss didn't acknowledge him. She walked directly to the mahogany table and gestured for the HR manager to leave. "I will take this one. Please bring me his full file." Once they were alone, she sat down directly opposite Daniel. She picked up his resume, her fingers tracing the words on the page. Then she looked up, her gaze locking onto his. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something. Recognition? "Daniel Hayes," she said, her voice a cool, commanding whisper. We've met, haven't we?" He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his professional composure. "I don't think you would remember, Ms. Voss." "Oh, I remember things very clearly now. You were the man last night." Her words were not a question, but a statement of fact. "I just happened to be passing by," he repeated, sticking to his simple, unassuming narrative. Clara leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. This was not an interview about circuits and maintenance schedules. This was personal. "Why did you help me, Daniel?" she demanded. "You didn't know who I was. You gained nothing." Daniel looked her straight in the eye, remembering Lily's simple goodness. "I helped you, Ms. Voss, because I hope that if my daughter ever falls down in the street, alone and in trouble, someone would do the same for her." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Clara's perfect, rigid posture seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. She stared at him for several seconds, processing the sheer simplicity and purity of his answer. She finally pushed his resume away. "The interview is concluded," she announced. Daniel felt a sinking feeling of failure. He must have offended her. "Follow me, Daniel." Confused and resigned to having blown his only chance, he trailed her. She led him away from the standard offices, across the gleaming sky bridge, and into the highest executive tower, to the floor reserved exclusively for the CEO and her top-tier staff. She opened the door to a private office with a panoramic view of the entire city. "You start today," she told him, turning to face him. Her voice held a note of conviction he hadn't heard before. "I don't hire the best talent, Daniel. I hire the best people." Later that day, Clara's longtime executive assistant confided in a colleague. "I never saw the boss smile at anyone. She's notoriously cold. But that day she just looked different." She said, "He didn't save me because he knew who I was. He saved a human being, and that is why I trust him completely." Daniel Hayes started his new job in the vast, complex technical department of Voss Innovations. The corporate environment was a whirlwind of ambition, backstabbing, and relentless competition. A world away from the quiet, honest labor he was used to. The whispers followed him instantly. "Did you hear? He just got lucky. He probably used some connection. He's an average engineer, only hired because the CEO felt charitable." Daniel ignored the gossip, focusing on Lily's words and his own deep-seated ethics. He worked with a quiet, unwavering diligence that quickly set him apart. He didn't chase recognition, he chased perfection. His focus was always on ensuring every circuit, every wire, and every system was stable, reliable, and safe. This dedication, however, quickly created friction. The existing team, used to cutting corners and postponing non-critical fixes, found Daniel's meticulous approach irritating. They were intimidated by his commitment to safety over speed. One afternoon, a senior engineer, Mark, cornered Daniel by the coffee machine. "Look, Hayes, we know the score. You're the CEO's pet project, but don't slow down the whole department with your moral code. We run an 80-20 risk model here, not a 100% perfection guarantee. You're making us look bad." Daniel simply looked at him, his face calm. "I'm making the system safe, Mark. If making you look bad means our product doesn't fail someone who needs it, I'm okay with that." This quiet defiance only fueled the internal resistance. Daniel found himself working increasingly long, solitary hours. He didn't complain. The work was his sanctuary. One particularly harsh Tuesday evening, long after the rest of the building had emptied, Daniel was still in the server room. The building's state-of-the-art security system had flagged a critical, intermittent bug, a potential vulnerability that could compromise the entire structure. The automated system had recommended scheduling a fix for the morning, but Daniel couldn't wait. He wasn't just fixing a security flaw, he was identifying a deep vulnerability in the emergency power grid distribution system, a system that, if compromised, could halt life-saving medical research taking place in the R&D labs on the 50th floor. He was deep in the complex tangle of code and hardware when the door to the server room opened. Clara Voss stood there, still in her sharp suit, her expression surprised. "You haven't gone home, Daniel?" she asked, looking at the time display, 10:45 p.m. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of metallic dust. "I found a serious flaw in the perimeter security subsystem, which is tied to the emergency power distribution. It's a low risk, but a risk nonetheless to the medical research on floor 50. I want the system running perfectly before everyone arrives tomorrow morning." "No one asked you to work overtime," she pointed out, her voice devoid of emotion. "The report said it could wait until the next maintenance window." Daniel stood up, his gaze steady and unwavering. "You don't need permission to do the right thing, Ms. Voss. The vulnerability is here, and I have the skills to fix it now. Waiting is an intentional choice to accept a risk I can eliminate." The simple, unpretentious conviction of that statement stopped Clara cold. She didn't move for almost a minute, simply watching him as he methodically tightened a connection. That single line of morality, "You don't need permission to do the right thing," had pierced the cynical armor she had built around herself for years. "Do you always believe in doing the right thing, Daniel?" she asked softly, the question seeming to come from a place of deep personal inquiry, not corporate curiosity. Daniel hesitated, his composure finally breaking just a little. "I do," he admitted, his voice dropping lower. "I lost my wife, Lily's mother, in a terrible accident 10 years ago. It was caused by a system malfunction, a critical technical failure that someone overlooked because they felt it could wait. I promised myself then, on the day I lost everything, that I would never let anyone else lose a loved one because of a technical oversight or a quick fix. That's why I do this job, Ms. Voss." Clara looked at him, and for the first time since that rainy night, her gaze softened completely. The cold, impenetrable shell seemed to crack. "I used to think the world was neatly split into two types, winners and losers, the successful and the failures," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "But you showed me there's a third type, Daniel. The decent person, the one who rebuilds the foundation while everyone else is fighting over the penthouse." A few weeks later, Daniel had successfully implemented a new, robust security protocol. He was making a noticeable positive impact on the whole department. But Clara was still wrestling with something much deeper than security codes. The memory of the betrayal that led to her drunken night and the subsequent failures it exposed drove her to seek true redress. She had spent days privately reviewing archive files, a decade's worth of submissions, proposals, and forgotten technical concepts. She was searching for a ghost, a groundbreaking, yet anonymous emergency relief system design that had been submitted years ago, only to be mysteriously plagiarized and buried by a former, unscrupulous vice president. This VP had convinced her at the time that the design was flawed and unusable, causing her to lose a critical government humanitarian contract. She had felt guilty for years, unable to find the original author who had provided such a brilliant humanitarian concept. The moment she cross-referenced the unique technical signature of that old design with Daniel Hayes's current file, she froze. It was him, the man who had saved her on the street, the engineer who insisted on working late to protect strangers. He was the same ethical visionary she had unintentionally overlooked years ago. She walked directly to his small, functional office, finding him preparing notes for the next day. She didn't knock. She simply entered and placed a single, yellowing file on his desk. "This is your design, isn't it, Daniel?" she asked, her voice tight with a mixture of relief and profound apology. Daniel picked up the file, his eyes scanning the familiar schematics he had drawn in his cramped apartment so long ago. He looked up, utterly shocked. You found it?" "I am restoring justice for the man who saved me twice," Clara stated, her voice clear. "Once on the cold street and once from the depths of my own cynical arrogance and professional blind spots." She paused, her eyes gleaming with sudden conviction. "That design was brilliant, Daniel. It was the only way to save that project. By burying it, my VP betrayed not just me, but the thousands of lives that system would have supported." Daniel looked at the file, then at her, and a rare, gentle smile touched his lips. It was a smile of pure, untainted forgiveness. "If that's the case, Miss Voss," he said lightly, "I only hope that the next time you choose to drink a little less." She stared at him for a moment, then threw her head back and let out a genuine, booming laugh. The first one her executive assistant could remember hearing in years. It was loud, free, and completely unexpected. A junior staff member, who often stayed late, observed the change firsthand. Since the day Mr. Hayes started, the boss stopped yelling at people. The overall mood changed. I overheard her telling the VP of operations, When someone helps you at your weakest moment, you cannot continue to treat others with coldness and contempt. It's an ethical debt we must repay, and we will start by ensuring our engineers are rewarded for honesty, not just profit margins. The transformation within Voss Innovations was palpable. The air of cutthroat competition began to thin, replaced by a focus on team stability and ethical conduct, a philosophy driven entirely by the CEO's new perspective. Employee morale, which had been abysmal, began to climb steadily. Teams started collaborating rather than competing, inspired by the quiet integrity Daniel brought to his work every day. Just 1 month later, Daniel was officially recognized, not just for his technical skill, but for his leadership and moral clarity. He was promoted to lead engineer, overseeing several key infrastructural departments. His promotion was met not with resentment, but with genuine respect, even from the formerly hostile senior engineer Mark, who approached Daniel and offered a sincere, if slightly awkward handshake. "You earned it, Hayes. You really did." But Clara's change was more than just a personnel shift. She channeled her immense resources into a tangible symbol of her restored faith in humanity. In a spectacular public announcement, she established the Hayes Fund, a charitable foundation dedicated to providing financial and educational support for the families of engineers and essential workers who had lost their jobs due to corporate instability or bankruptcy. It was designed to be the safety net Daniel himself had lacked. At the launch ceremony, held in the newly renovated Voss Auditorium, Clara Voss stood at the podium. She had always commanded attention, but today she spoke with a rare, compelling vulnerability. The usual corporate media were replaced by family representatives and former Voss employees who had recently been through hardship. "We all know the cost of failure in business," she began, her voice resonating through the large hall. "But too often, we forget the human cost of that failure. The families, the children, the good people caught in the crossfire of corporate instability. I was one of those people in a way, standing alone and helpless just over a year ago." She paused, allowing the audience to absorb the profound meaning of her public admission. "But a very wise man, a man who saved me when I was at my most broken, once said something simple yet life-altering. He didn't offer me money or a solution to my business problem. He offered humanity. He told me, 'You don't need permission to do the right thing.' And today I choose to live by that principle. The Hayes Fund is our company's commitment to doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. It is named after a man whose simple act of decency became the most critical turning point in this company's history." The massive crowd was utterly silent. No one clapped, not yet. They were simply absorbing the raw honesty of the city's most formidable CEO. Down below, Daniel stood, tears welling in his eyes. He hadn't sought this recognition. He had simply walked home in the rain. After the speech, as the crowd began to stir with appreciative murmurs and quiet applause, Clara found Daniel near the back of the hall. "That was quite the confession, Ms. Voss," he said softly, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. "And the fun, it's exactly what people need." She smiled, a truly beautiful and unguarded gesture. "It's what I needed, Daniel. If it hadn't been for you that night, I would still be drunk. Not on alcohol, but on my own crippling arrogance and self-pity. My fortune was my prison because I refused to share my vulnerability or see the pain in others. And if it hadn't been for you, seeing the value in simple kindness," Daniel responded, his voice gentle, "I would still be afraid of failure, afraid of every closed door. I would have believed the world was just cold, efficient, and unforgiving." "Perhaps," he suggested, meeting her eye, "we saved each other, Clara. You gave me a future, and I gave you back your past belief in goodness." She nodded slowly, the professional veneer completely gone. "Perhaps we did, Daniel. What a strange, beautiful circle that is." They stood for a moment, two entirely different people, bound together by a single shared moment of vulnerability and profound humanity. The interaction was a silent promise, a profound recognition that their paths had crossed not by chance, but by a necessity that transcended business and wealth. It was the moment they both chose to embrace a new shared future, defined not by profit, but by purpose. From this day forward, Daniel chose to look at the world a moment longer. He chose to see the person behind the title, the fear behind the fall. He made a vow to himself, one deeper than any technical promise. I will live decently. 1 year passed. Voss Innovations, under Clara's quietly transformative leadership, had launched its first major humanitarian endeavor, an ambitious, nonprofit engineering project to build sustainable off-grid infrastructure for a remote, impoverished community in the icy expanses of Alaska. Daniel, now respected across the entire industry, led the core team of engineers. And Clara Voss, the CEO, did not delegate. She flew with them, fully hands-on. She had learned that true leadership meant being present, especially in the most challenging environments. As the corporate jet climbed high above the cloud line, leaving the sparkling city lights far behind, Clara turned to Daniel, sitting across the aisle. Do you ever think about that night, Daniel? She asked, her voice calm against the gentle roar of the engines. If you had just walked past, ignored the danger, and gone straight home, everything in this entire company and in our lives would be different. Daniel took a moment, watching the reflection of the clouds race by in the window. I don't know what I would have become, he admitted, but if I had to choose again, knowing everything I know now, I would still stop. I would still cover you with my jacket. She smiled, a radiant, hopeful smile that transformed her face. She looked out the window at the vast white world they were flying toward. Sometimes, Daniel, a life-saving grace doesn't need to be repaid in cash or promotions. It just needs to be paid forward. That's what this trip is for both of us, a chance to pay it forward. They landed in a landscape of pure, unforgiving snow. The cold was immediate and intense. As they stepped onto the tarmac, the fierce Alaskan wind biting at them, Clara Voss reached out. She slipped her hand into Daniel's, her grip firm and true. It was a partnership forged in rain and proven in the cold. Thank you, Daniel, she whispered, her words lost almost immediately in the swirling snow. Thank you for making me believe in simple, profound kindness again. The former ice queen and the former maintenance man walked together, side by side toward the waiting jeeps and the arduous work ahead, leaving their old lives far behind in the city they had once thought was so cold. They were no longer defined by their titles or their past failures, but by their shared purpose. If you believe that healing stories where simple goodness conquers cynical greed, deserve to be told, please leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel. We tell the stories that should not be forgotten.